Picture this: 40,000 Ottoman warriors, the most feared military force on earth, armed with cutting-edge artillery and backed by an empire spanning 3 continents, descending upon a tiny Mediterranean island defended by just 500 knights and a handful of farmers. The year is 1565, and what's about to unfold will shatter the myth of Ottoman invincibility forever. This isn't David versus Goliath. This is something far more extraordinary. Get ready for the most incredible siege story you've never heard. Before we dive into this epic tale, smash that subscribe button because you're about to witness how 500 determined souls changed the course of world history. And trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. Welcome back to the channel where history's most shocking moments come alive. I'm your host, and today we're travelling back to 1565, to a small island in the Mediterranean that became the stage for one of the most lopsided yet decisive battles in human history. This is the story of how Malta, a rocky outcrop smaller than most modern cities, became the fortress that saved Europe itself. By spring 1565, Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent had reached his breaking point. For decades, this tiny island had served as home base for the Knights Hospitaller, a brotherhood of warrior monks who had made it their mission to harass Ottoman shipping lanes and disrupt the Sultan's carefully laid plans for Mediterranean domination. These weren't just random pirates, they were organised, disciplined and absolutely fearless in their raids against Muslim merchant vessels and pilgrimage ships. The Ottoman Empire at this time wasn't just powerful, it was the superpower of its age. Stretching from the gates of Vienna to the shores of the Persian Gulf, from the Crimean Peninsula to the sands of North Africa, Suleiman's realm controlled trade routes that connected 3 continents. His armies had conquered Belgrade, taken Rhodes, and pushed deep into Europe. Christian kingdoms trembled at the mention of Ottoman janissaries, and his naval forces dominated the eastern Mediterranean. But there was this one persistent thorn in his side: Malta. Every successful night raid was more than just a military setback. It was a personal insult to the Sultan's honour, a challenge to his divine authority as leader of the Islamic world. The Knights of St. John had been expelled from their previous stronghold on Rhodes by Suleiman himself back in 1522, and Emperor Charles V had granted them Malta on one condition: they had to serve as the shield against Ottoman expansion westward. Now, imagine the Sultan's frustration. Here he was, ruler of one of history's greatest empires, being constantly needled by what amounted to a handful of religious fanatics operating from a limestone rock in the middle of the sea. Every Christian galley they captured, every Ottoman merchant ship they seized, every Muslim pilgrim vessel they harassed, it all added up to one massive diplomatic and religious embarrassment. So Suleiman decided to end this humiliation once and for all. The force he assembled was nothing short of biblical in its proportions, the largest amphibious invasion since ancient times. We're talking about 130 war galleys cutting through the Mediterranean waves, 180 massive transport ships groaning under the weight of men and equipment, and somewhere between 25,000 to 30,000 crack troops. This wasn't just an army. This was the concentrated might of an empire unleashed. Leading this armada were some of the most capable military minds of the age. Mustafa Pasha commanded the land forces, a veteran general who had never known defeat. Admiral Piali Pasha controlled the naval operations, ensuring the massive fleet could deliver its deadly cargo. And then there was Dragut, the legendary corsair admiral whose very name struck terror into Christian hearts across the Mediterranean. At 80 years old, this man was still considered one of the most dangerous naval commanders alive. The Ottomans weren't just bringing soldiers, they brought everything needed for a prolonged siege. engineers who could tunnel under the strongest fortifications, artillery specialists with massive cannons capable of reducing stone walls to rubble, supply trains that could sustain an army for months, camp followers, craftsmen, and support personnel numbering in the thousands. This was total war, Ottoman style. Standing against this overwhelming tide was Grand Master Jean de Valette, a man in his late 60s who had spent his entire adult life preparing for this moment. His force was almost laughably small by comparison. 500 Knights of St. John, the elite corps of the order, each one a veteran warrior bound by sacred oaths. Supporting them were roughly 4,500 European mercenaries, mostly Spanish and Italian soldiers who had come seeking glory and gold. Finally, there were about 3,000 Maltese militia, farmers, craftsmen, and townspeople who had everything to lose if their island fell. The math was brutal. The odds were roughly 10-1 against the defenders, and that's being generous. The knights had enough gunpowder for maybe 6 weeks if they were extremely careful with their supplies. Their food stores weren't much better. The Ottomans, meanwhile, had brought enough provisions to sustain their massive army for months of campaigning. But numbers don't tell the whole story, and Grandmaster de Valette knew something that Ottoman commanders would soon discover. Defending your homeland changes everything. These weren't just professional soldiers following orders. They were men fighting for their families, their faith, and their very survival. May 18th, 1565, a date burned into Maltese memory forever. Ottoman scouts in small swift boats slipped silently into Marsamxet Bay under cover of darkness. What they reported back to Mustafa Pasha must have been both encouraging and concerning. The island's defences had been significantly upgraded since the last Ottoman intelligence reports. New star-shaped bastions crowned the heights, overlooking Grand Harbour, their angular walls designed to deflect cannon fire and create deadly crossfires for any attacking force. Mustafa Pasha was supremely confident as his massive army began landing on Maltese shores. His experience told him that fortress sieges against such overwhelming odds typically ended in quick surrenders. Why would a few hundred knights and some local militia choose death over the generous terms he was prepared to offer? After all, he commanded the finest army in the world, backed by the most powerful empire on earth. But as Ottoman forces established their beachhead and began deploying their siege equipment, it became clear that the defenders had no intention of negotiating. The star-shaped forts bristled with artillery, and every vantage point seemed to be manned by determined defenders who showed no signs of wavering. This wasn't going according to Mustafa's carefully laid plans. To maintain his aggressive timeline and achieve the quick victory that Suleiman expected, Mustafa knew he had to secure the deep water anchorage inside Grand Harbour. This would allow his heavy ships to unload supplies directly and protect his fleet from the fierce Mediterranean storms that could scatter his vessels across hundreds of miles of open sea. But controlling the harbour meant taking Fort St. Elmo, a relatively small fortification perched on the tip of the Sceberras Peninsula. From a distance, St. Elmo looked like a minor obstacle, a simple star-shaped fort that couldn't possibly house more than a few hundred defenders. Ottoman engineers estimated it would fall within a week, maybe 2 at the outside. It was just a stepping stone, a minor inconvenience on the path to total victory. Grandmaster de Valette, however, understood the real strategic situation with crystal clarity. St. Elmo was indeed expendable in the larger scheme of defence, but every day the Ottomans spent battering its walls was precious time bought for the main fortresses of Birgu and Senglea. While the enemy focused their fury on this small outpost, the defenders could strengthen their primary positions, coordinate with potential relief forces, and allow disease and supply problems to work their inevitable magic on the massive Ottoman army. What followed was 30 days of absolute hell. The Ottoman artillery, some of the finest in the world, began their methodical destruction of Fort St. Elmo. Massive 80-pound cannonballs crashed into the limestone walls hour after hour, day after day. The sound was indescribable, a constant thunderous roar that could be heard for miles across the island. Stone exploded into deadly fragments. Earth erupted in fountains of dust and debris, and the very air seemed to vibrate with the concussion of endless bombardment. Inside the fortress, the knights and their allies displayed ingenuity that bordered on genius. Cut off from the main defences and facing certain death, they turned desperation into deadly creativity. Under cover of darkness, they would launch daring raids against Ottoman siege positions. They created primitive but effective fire weapons, hoops soaked in tar and oil that could be rolled down the slopes into enemy trenches, turning Ottoman siege towers into towering infernos that lit up the night sky. The psychological warfare was just as intense as the physical combat. Both sides understood that this battle was about more than military objectives. It was a clash of civilizations, faiths, and world views. Every successful defense sent a message to the watching world that the Ottoman war machine could be stopped. Every Ottoman assault that failed weakened the empire's reputation for invincibility. Then came the blow that changed everything. Dragut, the legendary 80-year-old corsair who had terrorized Christian shipping for decades, was conducting a reconnaissance mission near the fort when a stone fragment from an exploding cannonball struck him in the head. The wound was mortal, and by June 23rd, one of the Ottoman Empire's most capable naval commanders was dead. The psychological impact of Dragut's death cannot be overstated. This was a man whose strategic brilliance had contributed to Ottoman victories across the Mediterranean. His loss was felt throughout the besieging army, from common soldiers who saw him as almost mythically invincible to high commanders who relied on his tactical expertise. Morale, that intangible but crucial factor in any military campaign, began to crack. We're just getting to the most incredible part of this story, where outnumbered defenders turn desperation into victory against impossible odds. Make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell, because what happens next will completely change how you think about courage and determination. Fort St. Elmo finally fell on June 23rd, but the victory came at a cost that shocked even hardened Ottoman veterans. The fortress that Mustafa Pasha had expected to take in a week had consumed an entire month. More devastating than the time lost were the casualties. Somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 Ottoman soldiers lay dead in the approaches to what amounted to a patch of shattered rock, no larger than 4 football fields. Mustafa, enraged by the unexpected resistance and appalled by his losses, made a decision that revealed just how personal this siege had become. He ordered the bodies of the fallen knights to be beheaded, then floated their corpses across Grand Harbour on wooden planks as a gruesome message to the remaining defenders. The sight of their mutilated comrades drifting past the walls was meant to break the spirit of the men in Birgu and Sanglea, Grand Mustardi. Valette's response was swift and equally brutal. He ordered the heads of his Ottoman prisoners to be loaded into cannons and fired back at the enemy positions. The message was unmistakably clear. This siege had moved beyond conventional warfare into the realm of blood feud. Neither side would show quarter, neither would accept anything less than total victory or total destruction. As July brought scorching Mediterranean heat, the siege intensified into something approaching pure nightmare. Food, water, and hope, once merely scarce, now ran perilously low within the beleaguered walls. The Ottomans, learning from their costly victory at St. Elmo, pressed their assault against the main fortifications with renewed fury and grim determination that spoke of desperation disguised as confidence. Ottoman engineers, skilled in the dark arts of siege warfare, began tunneling beneath the bastions of Birgu and Senglea. These weren't simple sapping operations, they were sophisticated mining, techniques designed to place massive explosive charges directly under the foundations of the defensive walls. When detonated properly, such mines could breach even the strongest fortifications, creating gaps that assault troops could exploit. But the Maltese defenders proved just as resourceful as their attackers. Women, children, and elderly men who couldn't fight directly joined the defense effort in ways that turned domestic skills into weapons of war. They hauled clay pots filled with olive oil to strategic positions along the walls, then poured the viscous liquid into the moats when Ottoman troops attempted to wade through. A single torch could transform these oil-slicked waters into rivers of fire, creating a hellish barrier that repelled even the most determined assault. August 15th, the Feast of the Assumption, dawned with an ominous sense of finality. Mustafa Pasha, under increasing pressure from Constantinople to achieve the quick victory that Suleiman demanded, launched a massive coordinated assault against both Birgu and Senglea simultaneously. This wasn't a probing attack or a limited objective operation. This was everything the Ottoman Empire could throw at the defenders in one overwhelming surge. Dozens of scaling ladders reached the ramparts as Ottoman troops poured forward in waves that seemed to have no end. For 3 brutal, chaotic hours, the battle devolved into hand-to-hand combat of the most savage kind. Swords clashed against scimitars, crossbow bolts flew alongside musket balls, and men died in close combat where you could see the face of the enemy you killed. In the midst of this carnage, Grandmaster de Valette, now 70 years old, appeared on the walls in full armour. In one hand he gripped a sword, in the other a crucifix, and his very presence seemed to galvanize the exhausted defenders. A knight who witnessed this moment later recorded that their lord appeared that day in the shape of an angry grandmaster, his fierce determination radiating outward to inspire everyone who saw him. The sight of their elderly commander fighting alongside common soldiers, refusing the safety of the inner keep, rallied the defenders for one final effort. Miraculously, impossibly, the Ottoman assault was repelled. Another 3,000 enemy soldiers lay dead outside the walls, their bodies adding to the growing mountains of casualties that surrounded the fortresses. But this latest victory came at a terrible price for both sides. The siege was taking its toll in ways that went far beyond simple battlefield casualties. The massive Ottoman camp, once a symbol of their overwhelming numerical superiority, had become a breeding ground for disease. Dysentery spread through the crowded tents, heatstroke felled men who had survived countless battles, and the constant stress of prolonged siege warfare began to finish what cannonballs and swords could not. The defenders were equally close to their breaking point. They were down to their last barrels of water. Their final loaves of bread were being divided among 9 men each, and the whispers of despair grew louder with each passing day. Even the most optimistic among them began to accept that relief might not come in time. In Sicily, Spanish Viceroy Don Garcia de Toledo received increasingly grim reports from Malta. His military advisors, looking at the numbers and the timeline, concluded that the island was finished. The smart play, they argued, was to write off Malta as a loss and focus on defending Sicily itself when the Ottoman fleet inevitably appeared off its coasts. But against all logic, against the advice of nearly every expert around him, de Toledo began assembling a relief force. 8,000 men were loaded onto 35 galleys, and then began the agonizing wait for favourable winds, divine intervention, or any sign that might give this desperate gamble a chance of success. Then, on September the 7th, a small fleet slipped into Meliha Bay at dawn. It was impossibly small compared to the Ottoman armada, just those 35 galleys carrying de Toledo's relief force. But they brought something far more powerful than their numbers suggested. The red and yellow banner of Spain flying prominently from their masts. Ottoman scouts, seeing these colours, instantly panicked. Was this the spearhead of a massive Holy League armada? Had the Christian powers of Europe finally united to launch a coordinated counterattack? The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Rumours spread through the Ottoman camp like wildfire. Some claimed to have seen hundreds of additional ships on the horizon. Others whispered of secret alliances between Spain, Venice, and the Pope. Mustafa Pasha, already demoralised by months of unexpected resistance and mounting casualties, found himself facing a terrible decision. His supplies were down to barely 10 days' worth. His men were exhausted and disease-ridden, and now there were enemy reinforcements on the island. In desperation, he ordered one final all-out assault, hoping to crush the remaining defenders before this new threat could organise and coordinate with the fortress garrisons. But it was too late. The spirit of the Ottoman army was finally irreparably broken. When the assault began, something unprecedented happened. The elite janissaries, the feared shock troops of the Ottoman Empire, simply refused to climb the scaling ladders. These were men who had never known defeat, soldiers who had conquered kingdoms and toppled dynasties. Yet after months of watching their comrades die against these stubborn walls, they had seen enough. The assault failed within an hour. For the first time in memory, an Ottoman army had been psychologically defeated, not by superior numbers or better equipment, but by sheer willpower and an absolute refusal to surrender. The myth of Ottoman invincibility, carefully cultivated through decades of victory, shattered against the limestone walls of Malta. On September 11th, the unthinkable happened. The Ottoman fleet, defeated and utterly demoralised, began loading their surviving troops. They burned their remaining tents to deny them to the enemy, spike their heavy cannons so they couldn't be turned against future Ottoman forces, and sailed away from Malta in what could only be described as a retreat. Europe, which had been holding its collective breath for 4 agonising months, finally exhaled. The relief was palpable, a mixture of disbelief and triumph that echoed from the courts of Madrid to the marketplaces of Warsaw. Church bells rang across Christendom, and prayers of thanksgiving filled cathedrals from Rome to Vienna. The price of this miraculous victory was staggering on both sides. Ottoman losses were catastrophic, at least 10,000 dead, possibly more, representing some of the empire's finest soldiers and most experienced officers. But Maltese losses were proportionally just as tragic. A third of the island's population had perished, including 250 of the 500 knights who had formed the core of the defence. Yet the psychological earthquake caused by this victory was far more significant than any casualty count. For the first time since the fall of Constantinople in 1453, the supposedly unstoppable Ottoman war machine had been stopped cold, not by a grand alliance of European powers, not by superior technology or overwhelming numbers, but by a handful of determined defenders on a tiny island fortress. The victory immediately captured the imagination of Europe. Accounts of the siege flew off printing presses in Antwerp, Venice, and Paris. Poets penned epic verses comparing the indomitable de Valette to Leonidas of Sparta, and the story of Malta's defence became the stuff of legend almost overnight. The Knights Hospitaller, flushed with new prestige and renewed purpose, began rebuilding their shattered stronghold. They christened their new capital Valette, creating a magnificent, meticulously planned city that still stands today as Europe's first planned city north of the Alps. Every street, every building, every defensive position was designed with the lessons of the Great Siege in mind. More importantly for the broader course of history, the Ottoman tide never again seriously threatened Italy or the heart of Western Europe. The empire, psychologically wounded by this humiliating defeat, began to pivot its expansion efforts eastward toward Persia and southward into North Africa. The dream of Ottoman expansion into the central Mediterranean was effectively dead. The aftermath of Malta's victory rippled across the geopolitical landscape of the 16th century in ways that few could have predicted. Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, whose grand ambitions had been so thoroughly thwarted by this tiny island, died the very next year on a muddy Hungarian battlefield. Legend claims he was heard muttering "Malta, Malta" in his final moments, though this may be more poetry than historical fact. Regardless, the defeat had clearly wounded him deeply. For the Ottoman Empire, Malta marked a turning point in their expansion. The psychological blow forced a strategic re-evaluation that changed the entire course of their imperial ambitions. Instead of pressing westward into the heart of Europe, they became embroiled in grinding wars for control of Hungary and renewed conflicts with Persia. The Mediterranean, once destined to become an Ottoman lake, remained contested waters. In Malta itself, the victory became the island's founding myth, a defining moment in national identity that resonates to this day. Every parish on the island still celebrates its local heroes from the siege, and every Maltese child learns about the incredible price of freedom measured in the limestone of their homeland and the blood of their ancestors. The Knights Hospitaller, who had been on the verge of bankruptcy before 1565, suddenly found donations pouring in from every corner of Christian Europe. Their revitalized navy would continue to harry Barbary pirates and Ottoman shipping for another 2 centuries, a testament to how completely their reputation had been restored by this single desperate defense. Voltaire, with his characteristic wit, would later famously observe that nothing is better known than the Siege of Malta. He was absolutely right. The victory had transcended military history to become a cultural touchstone, a story that embodied everything Europeans wanted to believe about courage, faith, and the triumph of the human spirit against overwhelming odds. So the next time someone tells you that numbers always tell the whole story, or that superior firepower inevitably wins the day, remember this incredible tale. Remember 500 knights, 3,000 brave, farmers and townspeople, and a 70-year-old commander who simply refused to hand over the keys to Europe. They didn't just win a battle, they transformed a tiny dot on the map into a continent's shield. They proved that sometimes, just sometimes, the right combination of courage, strategic thinking, and absolute determination can stop even the most overwhelming force that history can throw at you. The Great Siege of Malta stands as one of those rare turning points where individual will triumph over material advantage, where a handful of determined defenders change the course of world history. It reminds us that the most important battles aren't always fought by the largest armies or decided by the most advanced weapons. History is filled with massive clashes featuring hundreds of thousands of soldiers and artillery parks that stretch to the horizon. But Malta 1565 is different. It's that exceptional battle decided not by overwhelming numbers but by sheer willpower wrapped in chainmail and fueled by an unshakable belief in their cause. If this incredible story of against all odds victory doesn't make you want to dive deeper into the forgotten corners of history, then you might need to check your pulse. These are the moments that shaped our world, the decisions made by ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances that echo down through the centuries. Hit that like button if this story inspired you. Share it with someone who needs to hear about the power of determination, and subscribe for more incredible tales from history's most dramatic moments. Because the next time the future looks uncertain, someone somewhere will need reminding that even the smallest force can keep the door to hope wide open. Until next time, keep exploring the amazing stories that made our world.